August the 15th, 2010. We have just seen one of the closest World Championship finals in Pokémon TCG history, resulting in this picture. However, what these two players didn't know is that the game they were playing was set to be unrecognizable in a few months' time. Completely irreversible too. To quote a game director, these abilities may not make the game more balanced, but tend to make the matches more exciting for newer players. And these changes were set to come in right after many people's golden era of the Pokémon TCG. So let's compare these few months to see exactly what happened and why it was so catastrophic. So Michael Pramwa, the player on the left of our picture, found himself in the 2010 World Championship final, playing many people's best deck and format at the time, and to be honest, to ever exist, Gardevoir Gallade. Gardevoir had two fantastic features that made it a top tier card. The first is its power telepass, which should let you look at your opponent's discard pile once per turn, and you can use a supporter card you find there as the effect of this power. This meant you could double up on disruption supporters, like combining a judge to reduce your opponent's hand size down to 4, then play Osiris's initiative to limit their hand even further. Or you could play any two consistency supporters like Rotan's Research and Bebe Search for example. This meant Gardevoir decks had a layer of versatility and consistency that other decks just couldn't replicate. Since supporter cards are some of the most powerful cards to ever get printed in Pokemon, so being able to play 2 a turn every turn is rather nuts. And if that wasn't enough, Gardevoir's attack Psychic Lock would deal a respectable 60 damage, but it would prevent your opponent from activating any Poke powers next turn. This would lock some decks down, like in the mirror match for example, from preventing one player from using Telepass, or Bright Look from Luxray GL Level X for example, more on him later. And it somehow doesn't stop there, because you could make the argument that one weak point of Gardevoir was its damage output. I mean 60 isn't the greatest of numbers, even back then in 2010. But that's where Gallade steps in, with its Psychic Cut attack, who would provide a huge nuke attack at the start of the game, by dealing 60 plus 20 damage for each prize card you choose to flip over, meaning it would plow through anything once per game. You even had the Gardevoir Level X, which would let you swap your active with its teleportation power, and you could auto KO whatever was left on the field with the least amount of HP. Teleportation was a very nice power to have, because it would let you preserve energy when retreating. Very, very impactful. The main downside to the Gardevoir Gallade deck though, is that it was kinda slow to get out the gates, since it was a stage 2. But that's where Spiritomb from Arceus would step in. With its Keystone Seal body, it would prevent both players from playing any trainer cards while it was in the active, and Darkness Grace would let you evolve one of your Pokemon. This would let you set up your Gardevoir army while your opponent was well stocked, not doing much. With Gardevoir Gallade being so strong, how did it lose in the finals of the 2010 World Championships then? Well, Yuta was playing Lux Chomp, which is also many people's best deck of all time. Garchomp C Level X had the Dragon Rush attack, which would deal 80 damage to any one of your opponent's Pokemon, and with an energy gain, you could use that attack for just a double colorless energy attachment, making it very efficient, even if you did have to discard the double colorless energy afterwards. And since there wasn't any bench protection at the time, Dragon Rush was primed to KO anything it liked. And your backup attacker was one of the best cards of all time, Luxray GL Level X. It had the Bright Look power, which would let you swap your opponent's active when you evolved into it. By far the best gust in the game at the time, and this meant a lot of decks would play it, and that meant a lot of decks would play Luxray, like Gyarados and Dialga, but more on them later. And with power gain, you could attack with it, dealing a respectable 60 damage for 1 or 2 energy. What set Lux Chomp apart though, was just how fast it was at firing off these Dragon Rushes, since it could rely on the Osiris's Conspiracy engine, a supporter card that let you search your deck for a supporter, a trainer, and a galactic invention, so finding those energy gains to attack really wasn't that hard. Another galactic invention you could search from Cyrus is Power Spray, a card you could use on your opponent's turn whenever they attempted to activate a Poke Power. You could basically use Power Spray to negate that power from ever doing anything. This meant not only was you able to dissect your opponent's board via Dragon Rush, but you could also start them setting up too. And if that wasn't enough, Crobat G would provide extra bench damage with its power. That would deal 10 damage to one of your opponent's Pokemon when you put it into play. And since it was a basic, you could abuse it with Poketurn to pick it back up, put it back down multiple times. or you could use that to heal your attacker like Garchomp or Luxray as well. The latter of which would let you reuse Bright Look, don't forget. And even though it was those two decks that made the final layer in 2010, there were a few other decks that people had to be worried about, like Gengar, whose level X could forcibly remove your opponent's level X's from play, who would often level up from Stormfront Gengar as well, who would auto KO your opponent's active when it gets KO'd, thanks to Fainting Spell, meaning whenever Gengar got KO'd you flip a coin in your head, you would KO your opponent's Pokemon as well. That is rather good. And Shadow Rune would spread a ton of damage to Pokemon that have powers, and to be fair, you could even use Poltergeist, because these would slap SP decks for massive damage, since it would deal 30 for each trainer, supporter card and stadium card in your opponent's hand. Gyarados was a heavy hitter fast deck, who would deal 30 damage for each Magikarp in your discard pile for 0 energy. That meant you could use cards like Regice to get 3 in a discard pile quick, evolve your 4th into a Gyarados, and start swinging for 110 damage for 0 energy as long as you had an expert belt attack. And if your Gyarados got KO'd, you would use Broken Time Space to get another one back really fast. This deck was a surprise deck that won French Nationals in that same year. The Alga Level X would use a Deafen attack, which would stop your opponent from playing any trainers from their hand next turn or stadium cards as well, which on its own was disruptive enough, but its Pokebody would stop SP Pokemon from using their Pokebodies, which would catch a lot of the metagame out. Combine that with Metal Energy to reduce damage, Expert Belt to boost damage, and even the 2-2 Garchomp line to have a Dragon Rush threat, the Alga was a deck you really had to be careful of, since it would grind games out slowly but surely. Bear in mind, don't forget, Garchomp C Level X had the Healing Breath Poke Power, meaning whenever you would evolve into it, you would actually remove all damage counters from each of your SP Pokemon. This would make the Alga a very tough cookie to crack. So now we've looked at the main decks in detail, let's try and draw some commonalities between them. Pretty much all these decks have no way of hitting 120 damage multiple times, so one shots are very rare, meaning that game length was much longer. This in turn would make resource management very important. For example, if you can only play 4 double colorless energy, which you can, that means you could only ever do 4 1 energy attachment Dragon Rushes. So if any other DCs got discarded for any other reason, you'd be in trouble. Speaking of, the supporter lineups were all mostly search based, like Cyrus, Bebe Search or Collector. The main draw supporter that did see play was Felicity's Drawings, but that was kind of rare, because it was very costly to use outside of Gyarados decks. With supporters being search based, that led to less explosive turns on average, which again would help contribute to increased game length, because you couldn't just turbo through your deck at breakneck speeds to find all the combo pieces you needed. With the supporters all being search based, most of the draw power would come from Pokemon, like Claydol with its Cosmic Power, which would let you put 2 cards you like from your hand to the bottom of your deck in any order, and then you would draw to have 6 cards in hand. Most of the time, games could have been decided by who was the first player to get out a Claydol. You did have Uxie as well, to be fair, which would let you draw to have 7 cards in hand when you put it on your bench. Bear in mind, bench space was rather important, especially when you consider that most of the decks at the time were evolution decks, right? So if you wanted to have like a Gardevoir in play, a Gallade, maybe you had the Dusknoir or Machamp and a Claydol, all of a sudden, using Uxie might not be as easy as you might previously have thought. And when you actually sit down and think about it, most of the decks we looked at here were all evolution decks. I mean, Luxchomp and Dialga are technically stage 1s that you had to evolve in the active spot. So there was no real big bad basic deck that was swinging for massive damage fast. All of these factors led the metagame to feel very setup based, very long, with players jostling to get their stage 1s or 2s into play, all of which had multi-energy attacks too for the most part, which meant swapping your active via retreating was very hard and costly, because you don't really want to have to discard those energies if you had to fire off multiple attacks to win the game. This is one reason why Gardevoir Level X was so helpful. In the end, in 2010 though, it was Yuta's Garchomp deck that won, very narrowly beating Gardevoir Gallade in the final. However, what the player base didn't know is that the game creators wanted to take the Pokémon TCG in a different direction. And you don't have to take my word for it, because we have quotes from them that explicitly say so. So if we were to fast forward to the next year's World Championships, golly does the game look different. You see, Black and White was set to release, and within the set there were some absolutely monstrous cards. Some that would make the older cards look like they were from a completely different game in all honesty. Cards that, quote, Breacher's Nose, Pokemon must at some level be something that any child can quickly learn to play. So it's opted to bump up the numbers instead of introducing too many new ideas. Starting around the time of Black and White, around 2010, the company began making a conscious effort to find ways to make it harder for new players to get trounced by veterans. We designed cards in a way that even if a kid was playing up against someone much older, it will still be a game where at least the kid can feel like they're fighting on an even playing field. Okay, let's dig into the release of the Black and White set. The most egregious example of this isn't even a Pokemon, to be honest, it's a supporter. Let's look at Professor Juniper.
Huge. The first is Professor Juniper, which has the exact same text as the old Professor Oak, but it's a supporter now. Basically, you discard your entire hand and draw 7 cards. I know a lot of people might think that discarding your hand is a pretty big drawback, but depending on the deck, if you can burn through enough cards without having crucial ones left in your hand, drawing 7 cards right there is a huge card advantage for just 1 card. I've tested for Heart Gold Soul Silver on, and I found 4 copies of it to be pretty crucial in every deck that I've played. Definitely trade for them while you can.
Discard your hand to draw 7 new cards. Let's just compare this to Felicity's drawing from earlier. It's not even a contest realistically, is it? And if you were to zoom out and compare that to the other searching cards of the format like Bebe Search and Pokemon Collector, it becomes obvious quick what the strongest of these cards are realistically. Like, why on earth would you search for 1 Pokemon per turn when you can just draw 7 cards and hopefully draw into it instead? This would result in games feeling much more polarized with power spike turns, because instead of using Bebe Search or Claydol to draw cards, you could now just high roll and draw multiple evolutions in 1 turn, thanks to Professor Juniper. The only other real comparable draw supporter at the time was Professor Oak's New Theory, which isn't bad, but you know, not quite the same. And while Juniper was the most on-the-face obvious example of this massive change in game philosophy, let's be honest, it's a supporter. It's not really the end of the world. What did cause the end of the world though was Reshiram and Zekrom. These were basic Pokemon with incredible stats. Let's compare these stats to Yanmega Prime, which was a top card primed for the 2011 World Championships as well. Yanmega Prime is a stage 1 Pokemon with 110 HP. Reshiram and Zekrom were basics with 130. These two immediately put the format on notice and obliterated the competition. Not only did they have monstrous HP, but they both had 2 very good attacks. Outrage would deal 20 damage plus 10 for each damage counter on them, meaning with their monstrous HP, they could just bounce back any feeble attempts to KO them, all for 2 energy. But at the time, one-shotting them wasn't the easiest thing in the world to do, unless of course you was using Bolt Strike or Blue Flare. Bolt Strike would deal 120 damage, and then do 40 damage back to itself. But what if I told you there was a way to do the unthinkable, and power that up in a single turn? More on that later. And then Reshiram's attack Blue Flare would deal 120 damage as well, but you would have to discard 2 energy from itself. So in both of these instances, you could just play a single plus power, which would boost your Pokemon's damage by 10 this turn, and you were one-shotting both of them, making them by far the easiest way to bulldoze another one of those out of the way. This on its own is unrecognizable from the 2010 World Championships we were just looking at. But if we really want to make this look silly, let's see how we can power up Bolt Strike in a single turn. It could even be your first turn of the game as well. Since you could turn attach to Zekrom, very good. Then you could use Pachirisu to use self-generate, which would let you attach 2 energy to itself when you put it into play. And after that, you would use Celebration Wind Shaman to move those energies from the Pachirisu onto the Zekrom. Meaning, boom, turn 1 Bolt Strike. Meaning, if your opponent didn't open 2 basic Pokemon start the game, they could just lose right there. Out of the gates, the ZPS deck was strong, sure, but it would take a few sets for Zekrom to reach its true power, with Electric hitting the scene, more on that later. So for the 2011 World Championships, which is the event we're going to look at in more detail, Reshiram was definitely stronger. Since even though it was slower to power up, because you couldn't really get it rolling in a single turn, it had a much stronger, more realistic game plan, since you could play it in 2 different ways. The first way was with Typhlosion Prime, whose afterburner power would let you accelerate a fire energy from your discard pile to one of your Pokemon, and after that you would place a damage counter on that Pokemon. Meaning, as long as you had 2 Typhlosion Primes out, you could chain blue flares over and over and over again, all of which were doing 120 damage, which would one-shot pretty much everything in the game, don't forget. In this style deck, you could even use Ninetales to draw cards via its Roast Reveal ability as well. Other draw-based Pokemon would include cards like Cleffa, who would let you shuffle away your hand and then you would draw 6 cards for free. And this is pretty helpful, since you would end the turn with a refilled hand after playing a few cards. And even though Cleffa was guaranteed to go asleep, it was okay, because its body meant it wouldn't take damage if it was asleep. And then if it was awake, it had a free retreat cost as well, very good. The other way to play Reshiram was with Emboar, who had the Inferno Fandango ability, who would let you attach as many fire energy as you liked from your hand to your Pokemon in a turn. We have seen this style archetype do well all throughout Pokemon history, and Emboar was set to be no exception. This more explosive Emboar style deck could also play Deoxys Rayquaza Legend to take extra prize cards with its Pokebody and its Ozone Buster attack, with the attack dealing a massive 150 damage, meaning it had no problems one-shotting everything in its path. This was much more explosive, to be fair, but you needed to have a stage 2 in play Emboar to get the energy rolling, and you'd also have to have a way to recycle those energies back from the discard pile to keep attaching them. But we did have cards like Energy Retrieval to get them, and Junkarm could help you reuse them as well. This meant the 2011 metagame was unrecognizable from 2010. And sure, this is partly true because of the hefty mid-season rotation to stop Sableye from winning every game turn 1. I'll probably do a video on that at some point. But even with that being said, let's just look at Reshiram and Zekrom versus Gallade, both of which were one-shot merchants, both for free energy, except Gallade could only do that once at the start of the game as well, and you would have to attach 3 energy manually from your hand to do so, whereas Reshiram and Zekrom could do this as early as turn 1 or turn 2, and can continue doing this turn after turn after turn. This is madness when you consider Gallade as stage 2, and these two are basic. So not only were evolution Pokemon heavily hit this year, but gameplay styles would also change as well. Since now the format was so aggressive, resource management kinda went out the window, since Reshiram could just recycle those energy from the discard pile via Typhlosion or Emboar using energy retrieval. And with Junkarm being in the format now as well, it suddenly didn't matter about holding on to as many cards as possible, because Junkarm could start to get them back. And this is evident at the 2011 World Championships, where we saw Sage's training see a lot of play, whereas before, these kind of supporters were very rarely used. Since draw power was the aim of the game now, not searching out cards once per turn with cards like Babysit. So after looking at that, how do you think the metagame transformed? Let's look at the 2011 World Championships and see how it played out. Well, we have looked at Reshiram and Zekrom for sure, but there are some other decks to quickly cover first, and some of them did actually evolve, to be fair. For example, Yamega Magnezone. Yamega was a stage 1 Pokemon that had 110 HP, but an amazing Pokebody Insight, which would reduce all its attack costs on the attacks of it if both players had the same amount of cards in their hand, meaning you could do a 40 damage snipe with linear attack for free, or do Sonic Boom for a free 70 damage into the active. This meant Yamega was often played with Magnezone, since Magnezone would draw cards via its magnetic draw power, which would help you with Insight, but it also provided a massive nuke attack with Lost Bird, something that Yamega just couldn't offer, which would let you put any amount of energy attached to your Pokemon into the Lost Zone, and you would do 50 for each one you did. Jirachi also saw a little bit of play here, since it would help out with Lost Bird, since when you would bench it you could flip 3 coins, and for each head you could attach an energy from your discard pile to it, giving you a potential extra 150 damage for a Lost Bird. This deck was very good. There was also a stage 1 rush deck where you would use Donphan Prime to dish out massive damage via Earthquake for a single energy, and bear in mind it also had the exoskeleton body, meaning it was very tanky. And it would also hit Zekrom for weakness. This stage 1 deck would also play Zoroark, who would use Foul Play for a DCE attachment, and Foul Play would copy one of your opponent's attacks and use it as this attack. If you use Foul Play into a Reshiram, you could copy Blue Flare, do 120 damage, and you wouldn't even have to discard any energy, since you technically don't have any fire energy attached to you already. So with 1+ power, you would actually start to one-shot the big boys. So even with those evolution decks being very good, it was Reshiram who took up 50% of the Day 2 World Championship field, 3 of which had Magnezone in them as well. Yamega Magnezone took up 7 slots, and stage 1s took up 5. However, the top 8 was a bit of a sad story, with Reshiram decks taking up 6 of the top 8 slots. There was 1 Yamega Magnezone and 1 stage 1s as well. And one, well, to be fair, random deck that no one saw coming, that had Renucleus to move around damage on your Pokemon, Vileplume to train a lot, and quite honestly a medley of different attackers like Donphan, Zekrom and Entei Suicune Ledger. That deck, named the Truth, made it all the way to the final, where it matched a Magnaball Reshiram deck in the final. So who would win? The fancy new Rogue or the format Titan? Well, the format Titan of course, and Reshiram Emboar Magnezone picked up a World Championship title. And by the time 2012 rolled around, this problem was just compounded by like to the power of 10. The basic train had fully left the station, with the next World Championship deck playing only basic Pokemon. In fact, from the top 8 decks at that event, with where the lists were available, there was only one evolution Pokemon present, and that was Espeon. And with cards like Ultra Ball, Pokemon Catcher and Dark Patch not helping this situation, along with the shiny new EX card. But that right there is a story for another day. So, April 25th, 2011, that was the day the Pokemon TCG changed forever. Real quick, I have to give a shout out to this video sponsor, Dragon Shield. They make the best accessories in the game, and if you want to get your hands on some and save yourself some money, click the link down there and use my code BERT to get 5% off, and it helps me out too. Let's get back to the video.